Hello everyone, welcome to Study Capital YouTube platform. My name is Atul Mishra and I'm your mentor for CUET PG 2025 MA English Entrance Examination. In this video, we are going to talk about two very important literary movements of 20th century, Modernism and Postmodernism. We are doing this because when you'll see your last year PG entrance examination paper, there were around 15 questions directly or indirectly from 20th century, because there are multiple groups, clubs and literary movements associated with 20th century. That's why we are going to talk about modernism and postmodernism. It is very important to differentiate between the characteristics of modern era with the characteristic of postmodern period. Before we start talking about characteristics of modernism and postmodernism, you need to differentiate between what is modern age and then what is modernism. Similarly, what is postmodern age and then what is postmodernism. So when we see modernism and postmodernism, these are broader terms, umbrella terms, like a lens, such as you have different types of ism including feminism, Marxism and other movements. So modern age is basically a period which starts from 1901 with the death of Queen Victoria, and it is there till the Second World War, and after that we call it as a postmodern period, after the Second World War. Although in literature we have Leotard and others writing and creating new theories from where it actually, the lens of postmodernism actually starts. So first we'll talk about modern period and how we enter into the 20th century. Think about it. So the period before modern age was Victorian period. So from 1837 to 1901, Queen Victoria was ruling over England, and that period is Victorian age. When you read literature of Victorian period, it is characterized by what you say realism, naturalism, writers writing novels in serialized form. There is a lending library culture. So you read about Bronte sisters, where you have Jane Eyre, very important text. Last year there was one question from Jane Eyre in your examination. You read a character called Heathcliff, which is considered as a Byronic hero character in a very important text by Emily Bronte, Wuthering Heights. You read Dickens, all of the novels by Dickens, a very good example of realistic writings as well as Newgate genre. And you read Thackeray, and there are many other writers which you can think of. In terms of Victorian poetry, you have Arnold, you have Tennyson, who is a representative, Browning, and many other writers. Now, why I am talking about these writers? Because when you see these writers are writing, there is a typical characteristic that is associated with these writers. When you think about poetry, you think about narrative poetry, you think about dramatic monologue. When you are thinking about the Victorian period, when you think about the novel, you think about realistic writing. Now, as we have seen, Victorian era is also an era of conflict. So in 1859, there is a text which was published by Darwin when he gave his evolution theory, and with that text we find there is a doubt between people whether they should believe in religion or they should believe in science with the theory of evolution. And that is the main point, because after that we are entering into the 20th century, which is basically an era of modernism, or what we call age of basically modern age. So you see the faith of pillars. All human being in general, they need someone to rely upon, the faith of pillar. And when we enter into the 20th century, all faith of pillars are somehow shattered. How it happened? You see, first there's a hierarchy. You read Great Chain of Being during the age of neoclassical period. Lovejoy has also written a text called The Great Chain of Being, and you read about it when you read Alexander Pope. So there is God at the at the top of the hierarchy, and then there is good angels, bad angels, human beings, and that's how the narrative goes. So the God was the center before that, right? Now, because of this text by Darwin, people were in doubt whether they can actually rely upon God or not. So this doubt that people had. Because of that, they cannot rely upon God, because there is science, and science has proved that there is no God, right? You can read about Bertolt Russell as well, his teapot theory, which indicates the reasoning why we cannot rely upon God. There are multiple writers as well. You can go back and read Shelley, and Shelley's atheism is evident in his text called The Necessity of Atheism, for which he was also expelled from Oxford University. There are many other texts, An Address to Irish People, and there are so many other political pamphlets that Shelley has written. So the point is, when we are entering into the 20th century, we cannot rely upon God. The next faith of pillar was king. If we cannot rely upon king, we can rely upon king. The whole, if we cannot rely upon God, we can rely upon king. Think about the concept of, what we have seen in the past. The civil war that took place between 1642 to 1651, Charles I was beheaded in 1649. Why? Because he declined to negotiate with the parliament. Divine rights of king. It starts with 1215, Magna Carta. And from there to the civil war, we have seen kings were not negotiating with the parliament, and that's why we have 1629 to 1640, what is known as 11 years of tyranny. That's a different study. But when we enter into the Victorian period, at the end of 19th century, we find there is Marxism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engel, they have published certain text which talks about how king is responsible for the exploitation of the working class people. You see, there is a Chartism movement, and there are many other movements during the Victorian period which established the fact that king is responsible for the exploitation of working class people. That means when we enter into the 20th century, we cannot rely upon king as well. So God is gone, king is gone. So people thought, okay, we can rely upon democracy, the democratic world that we had in 20th century. Now, the First World War and the Second World War happened in the first half of the 20th century. So many people died. There is no result of either the First World War and the Second World War. So the large bloodshed that we see, people cannot rely upon democracy as well. There is, a doubt that people had in their mind into the 20th century. So now we cannot rely upon God, we cannot rely upon king, we cannot rely upon democracy. So people thought, okay, if we cannot rely upon the external things, we can still rely upon ourselves. Now you see, we are talking about 20th century, and exactly in 1900, Interpreters of Dream by Sigmund Freud was published. Now in this text, Freud talks about, he basically divide our mind into three parts: conscious, subconscious, and unconscious mind. Like the Freytag model that we read, iceberg theory, which we actually read in writings of Hemingway. We'll talk about it later. But the main idea is 90% of our things that are related to us are in our unconscious mind, and human beings have no control over them. That means you are not aware about your things. How can you can aware about the world around you? That means you cannot rely upon God, upon king, upon democracy, and also upon yourself. And this is how we are entering into 20th century. This is modern period for all of us. Right now, we see what happens in the modern period. This situation that we are talking about, how it is represented by the modern writers. When you think about the modern writers, you think of James Joyce, you think of Virginia Woolf, you think of many other writers, E.M. Foster and others, T.S. Eliot, E.M. Foster, Ezra Pound, and the list goes on. Now what these writers will do if the situation is like this? There is fragmentation. Now this fragmentation is represented in literature as well. So there is the problem, and we find that non-linear plots are introduced. We find there is stream of consciousness. William James coined this term called stream of consciousness, which was actually used by May Sinclair in the writings of Dorothy Richardson. She implied the concept of a stream of consciousness in the writing of Dorothy Richardson for the very first time. In literature, we are not talking about psychology. In psychology, it was obviously William James who wrote a text in 1890 where he coined this term called stream of consciousness. So that simply means you're writing the way thoughts are coming in your mind. So you'll go in future, you'll go in past, and you can also talk about the present. There is non-linearity. So when you think about literature, literature is also non-linear. There is fragmentation. But you see, writers will be involved in multiple ways through which they are looking for meaning. So still they believe in objective truth, they believe in what you say, that there is meaning possible. So you'll find the fragmentation that writers are trying to resolve the problem and they're looking for solution. Now how they'll do it, they'll if you think about the wasteland, it talks about the fragmentation, but it also goes in lineage of what you say, Indian tradition. The ending of the wasteland typically depicts the idea. So there is problem, but the writers of the modern era were trying to resolve the problem, trying to find the solution. That means they believe in objective truth, they believe in meaning, and for them there is one meaning, that is they are looking for. This is modernism. Okay, with this introduction I'll introduce you with some characteristics of modernism. I'll show you how it is different from postmodernism, and then what are the things that you can actually explore in postmodern literature, which is actually important for all of you, because new genres that are coming into existence, we find that starts with postmodernism. Okay, so moving ahead, you see there is what you say, fragmentation. There is no center that we talk about, because center is moving to periphery, which we will literally see in post structuralism. So we see there is a loss of unity. We see there is it's the writing will also suggest that works of art can provide unity. So there is a lack of unity, but the literature, the art, can provide the unity that is needed. So there is meaning. We are seeing the loss of the meaning, but the art is it will be giving us meaning. So this is one escape that writers are looking at. So what we find, that meaning is lost in the modern life. We have seen the pattern, and the writers will write in such a way that they will try to find out the solution. Wasteland is a very good example for this particular unit, right? So we see that Eliot in the Wasteland laments the modern world, and he says it is an infertile wasteland. You see a very important text that was published in 1922. There are many other texts. The Hairy Ape was published in 1922, right? Ulysses, a novel by James Joyce, was published in 1922. That means the year 1922 is very important. Now he talks about the infertile wasteland. He talks about the fragmentation. He talks about the incoherence of this world and how it affects the structure of the poem. But you also see that he is also trying to recapture the lost meaning, trying to recapture the organic unity by doing what? He's looking towards the Eastern culture. He's looking towards, he's using terraces as a protagonist, and that's how you find that he's still looking for solution. This is, one thing. That means modernism finds this fragmentation, this loss of unity as tragic. This is very important topic. This is very important point. Please understand that the tragic, the element of fragmentation, the element of loss of unity is considered as tragic, and that's why they are looking for solution. Now we move to the period of postmodernism after the Second World War. Think about modernism. There are so many movements, and which we will be covering in our videos, and there is also a batch that is going on. You can join, and there you'll also we'll also talk about so many movements during modernism. You can think of the decadent movement of 1890s, from where it starts. There is surrealism, Dadaism, Imagism of 1910. There is lost generation of 1920s. There is there are other movements as well. Negritude movement, Black Mountain poetry of the 1920s, the Auden group, or what is a left-wing poetry in 1930s, New Apocalypse poetry of 1940s. This is modernism. You see how we will talk about the characteristics of modernism in a separate video, and we'll talk about what is the new change, what is the experiment that is going on in the modern period. Now moving ahead, now we see the fragmentation and loss of unity was considered as tragic in the modern period. But when we move ahead with the idea of postmodernism, that means we are moving in 1950s, 60s, we find these problems are no longer problems. That means fragmentation and the loss of unity is not at all tragic. What writers started doing, they started enjoying these problems. That means there is a problematization of problem. This is one term that we associate with postmodernism, which typically talks about that basically the writers will try to create those characters who are absurd in their in their way. That means they will enjoy the problem. You can think of the myth of Sisyphus. We can talk about the myth of Sisyphus in different video altogether. But if you're aware about the theater of absurd, Martin Islin, and writers like UNESCO, Samuel Beckett, Pinter, and others, you are probably aware about how these writers talked about this fragmentation in a way that they are actually enjoying it. So the characters are enjoying this fragmentation, enjoying this, what you say, loss of meaning. So there is no objective truth in postmodernism. There is not one truth. Think about it. And that's why modernism, you can relate modernism with second wave of feminism, and you can associate postmodernism with third wave of feminism. We'll talk about this thing in our upcoming videos. But try to understand modernism, second wave of feminism, and structuralism on one side, also the first wave of psychoanalysis where we have people like Sigmund Freud and others on one side, postmodernism, post-structuralism, reader response theory, third wave of feminism, and the second wave of psychoanalysis on the other side. They are very similar in their approach. You can think about unity in modernism, which is lacking, and they are looking forward to unity. And in postmodernism, they are talking about inclusivity. So you need to think about all other branch. There is no one truth, there are multiple truths, and that is also represented in literature. There is no one meaning, there are multiple meanings. So how you'll represent it in literature? There are texts where we have multiple endings. You can think about 1969 text, French Lieutenant Woman, which is famous because there are multiple endings. There is one Indian text as well, Nagamandala, written by a very famous Indian dramatist. There we also have multiple endings. You do have certain texts which are precursor to postmodernism where we have multiple endings. This is a question that I'm asking you, which you have to reply in the chat box. There is a text by G.B. Shaw, who is a modern writer, a late Victorian and early modern writer, and there is one text that he has written where we have multiple endings, which is actually a characteristic of postmodern literature. So what happens in postmodernism? Remember now this disorientation, how there is no center. We'll see how postmodernism and post-structuralism meets at this point, because post-structuralism of Derrida in 1966 gave his lecture in the Hopkins University, Structure, Sign and Play in the Human Sciences, and he talks about there, how center is moving to the periphery and periphery is moving to the center. That means there is no center. How we depict? So we have two things, signifier and signified, which we'll eventually cover in the structuralism and post-structuralism classes. But if you are aware about these two terms, Derrida says, we always move from one signifier to another signifier to another signifier. There's a chain of signifier, which he calls it as a transcendental signifier, and there is no signified, which means there is no fixed meaning. So how you represent in literature? That means there is no one truth, there are multiple truth. There is no objective truth. If we talk about subjectivity, right? So postmodernism will talk about these things. They will say that fragmentation is the only way of living life. So we have seen fragmentation and the loss of meaning was tragic, but now these writers in postmodernism will try to talk about fragmentation. They will celebrate this thing. So and that is the point where we see postmodernism meets post-structuralism, which we'll cover in our next video. Now so what we see now, what are the characteristics of literature? There is a writer called Lyotard, and he wrote a text called Postmodern Condition, a report in 1979. He says, postmodernism is incredulity towards meta-narrative, which simply means that the grand narrative is, in general I'll talk about it, so grand narratives are related to modernism, and postmodernism reject grand narrative and talks about what he says little narratives, right? So what is grand narrative? The what you say overall archive, like religion, caste. So the complete genre altogether, which says there is one meaning and that's the only truth, are a part of the grand narrative. So in modernism we find that, but in postmodernism we have little narratives will give importance to the local events, right? This is one such difference that we find. Now remember, grand narrative and meta narrative are the same thing, which Lyotard prescribed to modernism, and little narrative is something that he prescribed to the postmodernism, right? Now so what's the difference, right? Now I'll talk about few typical characteristics of modernism and postmodernism, which is not here because we'll talk about modernism separately, postmodernism separately, and then I'll talk about simulacra, simulation, hyperreality of postmodernism. I'll tell you one more characteristic of postmodernism, which is of self-reflexivity. You know, the text of the postmodernism will talk about how the text are, you know, self-reflexive. They'll tell you about, you know, that you're reading a text. You can think of Italo Calvino, you know, his text, a very famous text. You can write it down in the chat box as well if you're aware about the text, where you find that the narrator is you, which symbolizes you, the reader, right? And then he's reading a text, you know, which carries a similar title, the text that you are reading to, right? So that means it's self-reflexive, what you say, meta-narratives. Now, you know, meta-history, there are multiple terms that are related to Linda Hutchins' concept of historiographic metafiction. So what is historiographic metafiction? What is metafiction? What is meta-narrative? What is self-reflexivity? And there are many other terms that you can actually prescribe to postmodernism. I hope I am giving you enough content that you can explore by yourself, and you can also, avail our batch is going on basically. Just a second. So, you know, this is the video where we talked about the difference between modernism and postmodernism. In different videos, we'll talk about how the literature of modernism and postmodernism. I'll give you multiple examples from modern literature, beginning from Ulysses, Mrs. Dalloway, E.M. Foster's Passage to India, how the things that we are talking about, the non-linear plot, the stream of consciousness is represented in modern literature, and then how self-reflexivity, no objective truth, subjectivity, meta-narrative, meta-history, historiographic metafiction, and other such things are represented in postmodern literature. So there are three terms which we will be talking about in our next video someday. Simulacra, simulation, and hyperreality by Baudrillard. Okay, so read about it, and in our different video we'll talk about it. Now we are also running a batch, and there is one crash course which is about to begin in few days. If you want to join our classes, you can use Atul sir 30 coupon code, and you'll get 30% off as a special offer. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the video.